Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale inspires and challenges us to see the world differently. Today's story unfolds in the heart of a bustling city, where one man's quiet strength and unwavering grace uncover the hidden biases lurking in plain sight. What starts as an ordinary banking visit quickly transforms into a powerful lesson about respect, equality, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Don't miss this unforgettable journey that reminds us all of the power of dignity and character. Subscribe now to Life Stories and join us as we begin today's remarkable story. The mid-morning sun gleamed brightly over the city of Charlotte, casting a golden hue across the bustling streets. James Whittaker stepped out of his sleek yet understated sedan, its glossy finish catching the light. He paused for a moment, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, and cast a discerning glance at the impressive facade of Summit National Bank. The marble-clad building stood tall and imposing, a symbol of trust and financial stability. But for James, this wasn't just a bank. It was a responsibility, a legacy he intended to shape with fairness and integrity. James was a man of quiet authority. At 45, he had spent years navigating the labyrinth of corporate finance, earning a reputation for his sharp intellect and an unwavering sense of justice. Yet, today was not about boardrooms or shareholders. Today, he had chosen to walk into one of his own branches as a customer, unannounced and unrecognized, to understand the experience firsthand. As he stepped through the heavy glass doors, a cool rush of air greeted him, carrying with it the familiar scent of polished wood and leather. Inside, the bank buzzed with activity. Customers queued patiently, while employees clicked away at their keyboards, their muted conversations forming a background hum. It was a typical morning in the heart of Charlotte. James made his way to the customer service counter, his steps measured and deliberate. His presence was unassuming, yet it carried a quiet confidence that seemed to command attention. The clerk behind the desk, a young woman named Emily Sanders, looked up with a polite smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I assist you today?" she asked, her tone warm and welcoming. James returned her smile. "Good morning. I'd like to make a withdrawal from my account." Emily nodded and was about to begin when a sharp voice cut through the air. "I'll handle this," said Bradley Mason, the branch manager. His tone was firm, almost curt. As he strode towards them, Bradley was a tall man with an air of self-importance, his perfectly pressed suit and meticulously styled hair reflecting his need for control. James turned slightly, meeting Bradley's gaze with calm composure. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Bradley's lips curled into a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We have certain policies here, sir," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "I'll need to see your identification." Without hesitation, James reached into his pocket and handed over his ID. Bradley examined it for far longer than necessary, his brow furrowing slightly. "And the purpose of your visit?" Bradley pressed, his tone sharpening as he handed the ID back. "I'd like to withdraw from my account," James repeated, his voice steady but firm. Bradley's eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry, but we'll need additional verification. You understand, it's just policy." James arched a brow. Policy or something else? A hush fell over the room. The subtle tension was palpable, drawing the attention of both customers and staff. Eyes darted toward the counter, curiosity mingled with unease. Bradley straightened, his posture rigid as he folded his arms. "If you can't provide the required verification, I suggest you return when you have it," he said, his tone carrying an edge of finality. James tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "So, you're refusing to serve me?" he asked, his words calm yet cutting. Bradley flushed slightly but held his ground. "I didn't say that. But we take fraud very seriously here, sir. I'm sure you understand." James nodded faintly, his gaze unwavering. "I do. More than you realize." The silence that followed was almost oppressive. broken only by the faint tapping of a keyboard somewhere in the distance. James reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone. His movements deliberate. "Yes. This is James Whittaker," he said into the phone. His voice low but firm. "Could you send someone down to Summit National Bank? It seems there's been a misunderstanding." As he ended the call, James turned back to Bradley, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Let's wait," he said simply, his tone polite but resolute. Bradley shifted uneasily, his confidence beginning to waver. He cleared his throat, glancing around as though searching for an escape from the growing scrutiny. Meanwhile, James stood with quiet poise, his hands clasped lightly in front of him. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Customers whispered among themselves, and employees exchanged nervous glances. Bradley, in a futile attempt to regain control, leaned over the counter and said, "You can't expect special treatment, sir. Rules are rules." James met his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking for special treatment, just the same treatment as anyone else." Bradley's face reddened, and he stammered, "You people always think." He stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. The color drained from his face as he met James's sharp gaze. "You people?" James repeated softly, his voice like steel. Bradley opened his mouth, but no words came out. The weight of his words hung in the air, undeniable and damning. And then, with perfect timing, the glass doors swung open. A tall man in a sleek grey suit entered, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. His presence was commanding, his stride purposeful as he approached the counter. "Mr. Whittaker," the man greeted, his tone filled with respect. "I came as quickly as I could." The room froze. Bradley's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and the clipboard in his hand slipped onto the counter with a clatter. You own the bank," he stammered, his voice barely audible. James turned to him, his calm demeanor unwavering. "That's correct," he said evenly. "And yet, here I am, being refused service in my own establishment." The silence that enveloped the room was deafening. Every person, from customers to employees, seemed frozen in place, their gazes shifting between James and Bradley. The weight of James's revelation pressed down on everyone like an invisible force, leaving the air thick with tension. Bradley's face paled, and for a moment, he looked as though he might topple over. His usual confidence, the authoritative presence he wielded so freely, had dissolved into visible unease. I didn't know," Bradley stammered, his voice faltering as he struggled to form coherent words. James tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. "You didn't know. And yet, you made assumptions. Based on what? Exactly?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unanswerable. Bradley's lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked around as if the walls themselves might offer him some form of reprieve. But there was none to be found. The man in the grey suit, identified by others as Nathan Daniels, the regional director, stood silently by James's side. His expression was composed, but there was a faint edge of disapproval in his eyes as he glanced at Bradley. "Mr. Whittaker," Daniels interjected, his tone measured. "Would you prefer to take this matter to the boardroom?" James's gaze shifted momentarily to Daniels, and he shook his head. "No," he replied firmly. "This is a lesson everyone here needs to hear." Daniels nodded and stepped back, silently deferring to James. James turned his attention back to Bradley, who stood frozen behind the counter. "Mr. Mason," James began, his tone calm but carrying a weight that silenced the faint murmurs in the room. "Let me ask you something. If I were wearing a different suit, driving a different car, or standing here with a different skin tone, would this interaction have played out the same way?" Bradley's eyes widened, and his hands gripped the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. I didn't mean," he started. But his voice trailed off under James's steady gaze. You didn't mean. James repeated softly, each word deliberate. But you did. Whether you intended it or not. Your actions spoke volumes. And those actions have consequences. Around the room, employees stood motionless, their faces reflecting a mix of shock, guilt, and reflection. Customers whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement with James's words, while others watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. James straightened, his posture exuding an effortless authority. He addressed the room, his voice calm yet resonant. "This isn't just about me," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "This is about every person who walks through these doors. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance, background, or the assumptions you may unconsciously hold." The words resonated, their impact visible on the faces of those listening. Even the youngest employees, who had perhaps never considered their own biases, seemed to shift uncomfortably as they processed James's message. James returned his focus to Bradley. "As the branch manager, you are the face of this institution to every person who comes here seeking our services. Your actions set the tone not only for your employees but for how this bank is perceived in the community. Tell me, Mr. Mason, is this the standard you want to represent?" Bradley swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the counter. "No, sir," he murmured, his voice barely audible. James nodded slowly, his expression softening just enough to acknowledge the admission. "Good. Recognizing the problem is the first step. But change requires more than acknowledgement, it demands action." Daniels, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, what course of action would you like to recommend?" James glanced at Daniels before speaking. "We will start by implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training across all branches. This is non-negotiable. Additionally, I want a dedicated reporting channel for incidents of this nature. Employees and customers alike should feel empowered to speak out if they experience or witness discrimination." Daniels nodded, already jotting down notes. "Understood. I'll ensure it's done." James returned his attention to Bradley, his tone soft but firm. "Mr. Mason, effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full review. Whether you have a future with this bank will depend on your willingness to confront the biases that led to this incident and your commitment to personal growth." Bradley's shoulders slumped, and he gave a faint nod. I understand." James took a step back, addressing the room once more. "For those of you who are still learning what it means to create an inclusive and respectful environment, I hope today serves as a wake-up call. This bank will not tolerate discrimination or bias in any form. Change starts here and now, with each and every one of us." The room was silent, the gravity of James's words settling over everyone present. Slowly, employees began to nod, their faces reflecting a mix of determination and respect. James exhaled softly, his calm composure unbroken. The silence that followed was not one of tension but of reflection, as the people in the room began to grasp the weight of what had just unfolded. The atmosphere in the bank began to shift. The initial shock of James's revelations was giving way to a mixture of introspection and resolve. Employees exchanged glances, some nodding faintly, others looking down as if grappling with their own thoughts. Customers who had been bystanders to the scene now seemed engaged, their whispered conversations filling the room with subdued energy. James took a step away from the counter, his gaze sweeping the room. "Before we all return to our work and lives, I want to make one thing clear. What happened today isn't just a single misstep, it's a reflection of a larger issue. Bias, whether intentional or not, influences how we see and treat others. And unless we confront it, it will continue to hurt the very people we aim to serve." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Even those who had initially dismissed the unfolding drama as a mere misunderstanding now seemed to recognize the depth of what had transpired. James turned his attention to Erin, the young clerk who had been silently observing from her station. Her wide eyes betrayed a mix of awe and uncertainty. "Erin, is it?" James asked gently. She blinked, startled that he had addressed her directly, and nodded quickly. "Why, yes, sir. Tell me." James continued, his tone warm but probing. "Have you ever felt judged, dismissed, or overlooked because of someone else's assumptions?" Erin hesitated, her gaze darting nervously around the room. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, sir. I have," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And how did it make you feel?" James pressed, his voice encouraging. Erin's cheeks flushed as she glanced at her colleagues, then back at James. "It made me feel small, like I didn't matter." James nodded, his expression understanding. That feeling, that sense of invisibility or rejection, is what we must strive to eliminate in this bank. No one should walk through these doors and leave feeling like they're less than anyone else. "Do you agree?" Erin's lips parted, and after a moment, she nodded firmly. "Yes, I do." Her quiet affirmation seemed to ripple through the room, resonating with those who had remained silent. One by one, employees began to nod, their collective acknowledgement a powerful statement of unity. James addressed the room once more. "We're all guilty of making snap judgments. It's human nature to rely on assumptions when we lack information. But as professionals, as people responsible for the trust and dignity of others, we must rise above those instincts. It takes effort, awareness, and a willingness to change." At that moment, one of the customers, a man in his late 50s wearing a neatly pressed shirt, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker," he began, his voice steady, "I just want to thank you for what you've done here today. I've been in situations like this before, where I felt dismissed, but I didn't have the words or the courage to stand up for myself. Seeing you handle this with such dignity gives me hope." The man's words were met with murmurs of agreement from other customers, their faces reflecting a mix of gratitude and respect. James offered the man a small smile, his expression warm but modest. "Thank you. It's moments like this that remind us why change is worth pursuing." James turned back to Daniels, the regional director. "Mr. Daniels, I want you to ensure that every branch of this bank adopts the measures we discussed earlier. Sensitivity training, open communication channels, and a renewed commitment to treating every individual with respect. This isn't optional, it's a mandate." Daniels nodded, his expression resolute. "Understood, sir. Consider it done." With that, James's tone softened. "I know change can feel overwhelming, but every small step we take in the right direction makes a difference. It's not just about policies, it's about building a culture where everyone feels valued, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension replaced by a sense of possibility. James turned to Bradley, who stood quietly to the side, his earlier bravado completely eroded. "Mr. Mason," James said, his tone firm but not unkind, "I hope today serves as a turning point for you. Mistakes don't define us, how we respond to them does. The next steps are up to you." Bradley nodded slowly, his face pale but determined. "Thank you, sir. I won't let this happen again." Satisfied, James addressed the room one final time. "Let's take what we've learned today and make this institution a place where people feel welcome, respected, and seen. The power to create that environment lies in all of our hands." As he prepared to leave, the room remained silent, but it was no longer the tense silence of before. It was a moment of reflection, filled with the quiet stirrings of change. For everyone present, this was more than just an incident, it was a catalyst for something greater. As James stepped out of the bank and into the warm sunlight, he paused to take a deep breath. Behind him, the atmosphere within the bank had shifted. Employees and customers alike had witnessed something transformative. It wasn't just about a moment of confrontation, It was about redefining what respect and integrity should mean in everyday interactions. James understood that true change didn't happen overnight. It began with conversations, moments of accountability, and the courage to confront what's wrong. He knew the path ahead would be challenging. But for him, every step mattered. This story is a powerful reminder: respect and kindness cost nothing but can change everything. Let's strive to see people for who they are, beyond assumptions or appearances. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales that challenge perspectives and celebrate the human spirit. Together, we can make the world a better place, one story at a time.